Could you imagine trusting your life to buffalo hide when you're facing Springfield rifles that punch through 4 inches of pine? What if that same hide could stop a mini ball traveling at 950 feet per second, a round that punched through Confederate earthworks like they were paper? What would you do if you watched a warrior take a direct hit at 30 yards, saw the impact, heard the strike, and then watched him lower his shield completely unharmed, the bullet flattened against leather you could carry with one hand? Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. This is what we do here. We dig up the frontier stories that got buried or forgotten. Today's story is about indigenous engineering that stopped Civil War-era rifles dead and left Army analysts writing reports that basically said, "This shouldn't be possible, but here it is." If that kind of story interests you, hit subscribe. We've got a lot more of them. And seriously, drop a comment about Native American technology that blows your mind. We love hearing what you're into. Now, let's go back to eastern Colorado Territory in 1864, where Private James Hawthorne is about to learn that his Springfield rifle isn't nearly as deadly as he thought it was. The rifle ball struck the shield dead center with a sound like a hammer hitting oak. Private James Hawthorne had fired from 30 yards, close enough to see the warrior's eyes widen at the moment of impact, close enough to see the individual fringes hanging from the shield's edge swaying with the wind across the Colorado plains, close enough to see the painted designs that covered its surface, a bear track, a lightning bolt, symbols that meant something to the man holding it, close enough to see the wear marks around the grip area, the slight discoloration where the warrior's hand had gripped the shield in previous fights, the small tears in the edge binding that had been carefully repaired with fresh sinew. The Springfield rifle had punched through Confederate breastworks just 6 months earlier at Cold Harbor, where Hawthorne had watched the .58 caliber balls tear through wooden fortifications that were supposed to provide cover. It had torn through pine logs at this distance during target practice at Fort Lyon, splintering wood that was 4 inches thick. The bullet should have drilled through buffalo hide and shattered the warrior's arm behind it, probably continuing through to exit somewhere in the warrior's torso. At this range, with this weapon, the outcome should have been certain death. Instead, the Arapaho warrior stood unmoved, not even a stagger backward from the impact. His feet remained planted exactly where they'd been before Hawthorne pulled the trigger. The shield showed a fresh dimple where the lead ball had struck, a circular depression maybe half an inch deep that caught the afternoon light differently than the surrounding leather, creating a shadow that made the impact point clearly visible. But the hide hadn't torn. No hole, no puncture, no blood spreading across the painted surface or dripping down onto the dry grass. The bullet had simply embedded itself in the hide like a stone pressed into clay, its kinetic energy, enough to kill a horse at this range, absorbed by material that shouldn't have been capable of stopping it. Hawthorne's hands shook as he tried to reload. His fingers fumbled with the paper cartridge, tearing the paper too soon in his haste, spilling black powder down the front of his uniform jacket. The powder left dark streaks on the blue wool. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with his own sweat and the dust of the Colorado plains, creating a scent that would stay in his nose for days afterward. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest like it was trying to break through his ribs. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a roaring sound that almost drowned out everything else. He could taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue, bitter and unwelcome. The warrior lowered his shield slightly, and for one frozen moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the scrubland of eastern Colorado territory. Hawthorne saw no triumph in that gaze, no mockery, no anger, no satisfaction at having survived what should have been a killing shot. Just the calm assessment of a man who understood exactly how effective his protection was and exactly how vulnerable his opponent had just become during the long seconds of reloading.
The warrior's face was painted for war. Red and black stripes across his cheeks, white dots across his forehead, but his eyes were studying Hawthorne with the clinical attention of someone evaluating threat level and deciding whether this particular enemy was worth pursuing or better left to flee back to his companions.
Hawthorne could see the warrior's chest rising and falling with controlled breathing, could see the muscles in his arms relaxed despite the shield's weight, could see the complete absence of panic or fear in his posture. This wasn't a man who'd gotten lucky. This was a man who'd known his shield would stop the bullet, who'd positioned it correctly to intercept the shot, who'd trusted his protection with the confidence that came from testing and experience. Then the Arapaho turned and disappeared into the broken terrain, taking with him a shield that by all logic of 1864 military engineering should not exist. The warrior moved with practiced efficiency, using the terrain's folds and draws to break line of sight, moving at a pace that was quick but not panicked. Within seconds, he was gone, vanished into the landscape like smoke dissipating in wind. Hawthorne finished reloading with shaking hands, but the warrior was gone. The engagement was over. Hawthorne had fired, had hit his target square, and had failed to kill him despite a perfect shot. He'd survived only because the warrior chose not to press the attack during those vulnerable seconds when the rifle was empty and useless, when Hawthorne would have been defenseless if the warrior had rushed him. That night, back at the temporary camp established by Captain Robert North's patrol, Hawthorne tried to explain what he'd seen to his sergeant. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the faces of the men gathered around it. The smell of coffee boiling in tin pots mixed with tobacco smoke and the ever-present dust. The sergeant, a veteran of 3 years of Civil War fighting and 2 years before that in Kansas border conflicts, listened skeptically while chewing on a plug of tobacco that bulged his cheek. "You missed," the sergeant said flatly, spitting tobacco juice into the fire where it sizzled on the coals. "Flinched. Pulled the shot. Happens to everyone first time facing Indians." "I didn't miss," Hawthorne insisted, hearing the defensive tone in his own voice and hating it. "I hit the shield square, dead center. I saw the impact. I saw the bullet hit. The shield didn't break. The bullet didn't penetrate." The sergeant spat again. "Son, a Springfield will punch through a man at 200 yards, clean through. I've seen it 100 times. It'll go through a horse at 100 yards, through and through, dropping the animal instantly. It'll penetrate a pine log thick as your waist at 50 yards. I've shot through logs during siege work. You're telling me buffalo hide stopped it at 30 yards? "I'm telling you what I saw." Hawthorne could hear how it sounded. Impossible. Unbelievable. The kind of story that made people question whether you could be trusted. But he knew what he'd seen. The sergeant shook his head slowly. "You saw wrong. Memory plays tricks when you're scared, and every man's scared his first fight. Or the powder was bad. That happens sometimes with ammunition that's been stored poorly. Or the ball was underweight. Contractors cheat sometimes, casting balls that don't meet specifications. Or something. But no hide stops a Springfield ball at 30 yards. Not possible. Physics doesn't work that way. Around the fire, other men nodded. They'd all seen what Springfield rifles did to targets. They'd all watched those .58 caliber balls punch through obstacles that seemed substantial. The idea that hide, leather, could stop that kind of firepower contradicted everything they knew about how weapons worked. Hawthorne didn't argue further. He could see it was pointless. But he knew what he'd seen, and he knew he hadn't missed. That shield had stopped a bullet that should have killed the man behind it. Somehow, impossibly, but undeniably. 3 days later, Captain Robert North had reason to reconsider that assessment. A skirmish 2 miles east of their camp left 5 Arapaho warriors dead and 3 wounded. The fight had been short but intense, both sides exchanging fire from behind cover, then a brief close-quarters engagement when the Arapaho attempted to flank the patrol's position. North's men had superior firepower and better positioning, and the outcome had never been in serious doubt once the Arapaho realized they couldn't break the patrol's defensive line. Among the recovered equipment was a shield. The warrior who'd carried it had been killed by a rifle shot to the throat, above where the shield's protection extended. The shield itself showed multiple impact points, 3 embedded bullets clearly visible, 2 more impact marks that might have been arrows that had broken off, and various scrapes and dents that suggested a long service life. Captain North examined the shield carefully, running his hands over the surface, feeling the embedded bullets, noting the compression damage around each impact point. He was a veteran of both the Mexican War and the ongoing Civil War. He had commanded troops at Chapultepec in 1847, where he'd watched American musket fire tear through Mexican defenders who wore leather armor that was supposed to provide protection. The leather had offered no meaningful resistance. The .69 caliber balls from smoothbore muskets had punched through it like it wasn't there, and that was with the lower velocity of smoothbore muskets compared to rifled weapons. He had fought at Shiloh in 1862, one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, where he'd seen what modern rifles did to human bodies at various ranges. He'd watched men torn apart by rifle fire, seen the devastating wounds that .58 caliber mini balls created, understood the physics of high-velocity projectiles and what they could penetrate. He thought he understood protective equipment and what contemporary firearms could defeat. The shield challenged everything North thought he knew. He could see where bullets had struck. 3 of them were still embedded in the shield's surface, their lead balls flattened from spheres into discs by the impact, but not penetrated through. He could feel them with his fingers, hard lumps under the leather on the shield's front face. The leather behind each impact point showed compression damage. The hide had been pushed inward by the strikes, creating shallow bowls, perhaps a 1/4 inch deep, that were visible when he looked at the shield from the side in good light. But there was no breach, no hole, no puncture. The internal layers, visible at the shield's edge where the rawhide binding had been damaged in the fight that killed its owner, showed no separation, no delamination, no structural failure. The bullets had hit, had been stopped, and the shield had maintained its integrity. The warrior had survived those impacts and had continued fighting until a different shot found an unprotected area. North pulled out his pocket knife and carefully worked one of the embedded bullets free. The lead was severely deformed, compressed into a disc that was perhaps 2/3 its original diameter. The rifling marks were still visible on the sides, confirming this was indeed a rifle ball and not a musket ball or some other projectile. He examined the cavity left behind. The bullet had penetrated perhaps 3/8 of an inch into the hide, creating a pocket that his finger could barely fit into. But it hadn't gone through. The layers beneath had stopped it completely. He tried to cut a small sample from the edge of the shield where the binding was already damaged, thinking he might send a piece for analysis. His knife, which he kept sharp enough to shave with, barely scratched the surface. He pressed harder, using enough force that he worried about breaking the blade, and managed to score the leather but not cut through it. The material was incredibly hard, far harder than any leather he'd encountered before. The warrior who'd carried this shield had walked away from shots that should have killed him. He'd survived long enough to be killed later by a different shot, this one catching him in the throat above the shield's protection, severing the carotid artery and a spray of blood that had soaked into the ground. But he'd lived through multiple rifle impacts because his shield had done what shields were supposed to do: stop projectiles that would otherwise have killed him. Captain North spent that evening writing a detailed report to the War Department, carefully describing what he'd observed and trying to explain it in terms that wouldn't make him sound like he was reporting impossible events or seeing things that couldn't be real. He knew how military bureaucracy worked from 20 years of service. Reports of impossible events were filed away and forgotten, dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Reports of unusual but carefully documented observations might actually be studied by people with the technical knowledge to understand them. He chose his words carefully, writing and rewriting several times before he was satisfied. The shield is constructed of buffalo hide, thickness approximately 1/4 inch at thinnest point, thickness approaching 1/2 inch at center where multiple layers appear to be present. Construction method unknown, but showing evidence of extensive treatment beyond simple tanning. Material properties unlike standard leather known to this officer from 20 years of military service. Testing with standard-issue ammunition at regulation ranges shows resistance to penetration that exceeds wooden shields of similar weight and approaches that of light metal armor. 3 bullets embedded in front surface show severe deformation but no complete penetration. Request analysis by qualified personnel to determine construction methods and material properties for potential application to military equipment development. He read the report over 3 times, making sure he hadn't overstated anything, making sure every claim was something he could defend if questioned. Then he signed it, dated it, and attached it to the shield itself, wrapping both in oilcloth for protection during transport. The report, along with the shield itself, made its way through military channels with the bureaucratic speed of a glacier moving across landscape. Fort Lyon to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, Leavenworth to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks to the Ordnance Department in Washington. The journey took 5 weeks, with the package sitting in various headquarters buildings waiting for the next supply wagon heading in the right direction. At each stop, someone examined the shield, tested it, wrote their own notes, and passed it along. At Fort Leavenworth, Major Thomas Sully, an artillery officer with extensive experience testing fortification materials, fired a .44 caliber pistol at the shield from 15 feet. The bullet embedded without penetrating, joining the 3 already present. Sully wrote a note. Material properties inconsistent with known tanned leather. hardness and penetration resistance suggest treatment process beyond standard tanning methods. At Jefferson Barracks, Captain Henry Hunt, an ordnance specialist, attempted to cut samples from the shield for laboratory analysis. Like Captain North, he found the material incredibly resistant to cutting. He managed to extract a small sliver from the edge using a razor and considerable force. The sample went into a sealed container for transport to Washington along with the shield. By the time the shield reached Washington in September 1864, it had been shot at least 6 more times by various officers trying to understand its properties. The tests used different weapons: Springfield rifles, Sharps carbines, Colt revolvers, all at various ranges from point-blank to 50 yards. Every test confirmed the same impossible reality. The shield stopped projectiles that should have punched through hide like paper. All 6 additional test shots had either embedded in the shield without penetrating or had glanced off when striking at angles rather than dead on. None had penetrated completely. The shield now bristled with embedded bullets like a pincushion, each one a testament to its effectiveness and a puzzle for military engineers trying to understand how buffalo hide could perform like this. The front surface was starting to look like a shooting target at a practice range, pockmarked with impact craters and embedded lead. The War Department's analysis was conducted by a board of 3 officers: Major John Gibbon, an artillery officer and expert on military technology; Captain Stephen Vincent Benet, an ordnance specialist with engineering training from West Point; and Captain James Riley, who had studied materials science at the military academy before the war. They examined the shield over a period of 2 weeks in September 1864, conducting additional tests, examining the construction with magnifying glasses, measuring thickness and density, attempting to determine composition. Their report, filed on September 24, 1864, and signed by all 3 officers, contained observations that ranged from technical measurements to frank admissions of puzzlement. The shield measures 22 inches in diameter, roughly circular with slight variations. Weight approximately 7 pounds. Thickness varies from 1/4 inch at edges to 1/2 inch at center, suggesting multiple layers, though precise determination is difficult without destructive analysis. Front surface shows extreme hardness, inconsistent with any tanned leather known to this board. Material resists cutting even with sharpened steel blades. Surface texture suggests treatment with heat and smoke, but specific methods cannot be determined from examination alone. 9 bullets are embedded in front surface, 7 from testing and 2 presumably from combat. All show severe deformation. None achieved complete penetration. Deepest penetration measured at 7/16 of an inch. The material appears to absorb impact energy through combination of hardness and layered construction. Edge examination reveals at least 3 distinct layers of hide with grain patterns oriented differently between layers. This suggests sophisticated understanding of material properties and structural engineering principles. Comparison to European boiled leather armor shows similarities in hardness but superior flexibility. The Native American material appears to maintain some ability to flex under impact, while European cuir bouilli typically becomes brittle. Conclusion: effectiveness impossible with standard buffalo hide treated by known European tanning methods. Construction method unknown. Material properties suggest treatment process of considerable sophistication. recommend further study of indigenous armor-making techniques as time and military necessity permit. That final recommendation was filed away with the report. The Civil War still dominated all strategic thinking. Sherman had taken Atlanta on September 2nd. Grant was grinding through the Petersburg siege. Lee's army was slowly starving in the trenches around Richmond. The war's outcome was becoming clear, but the fighting continued with desperate intensity. The conflicts with Plains tribes, while serious and costly in lives and resources, were secondary concerns to the existential struggle consuming the nation. The Shield was cataloged, assigned inventory number 1864.09.0247, and stored in a wooden crate in the Ordnance Department's warehouse on the edge of Washington. It sat there with hundreds of other pieces of captured equipment, samples of foreign weapons, experimental designs that hadn't worked out, and various military curiosities that someone had thought might be worth studying someday. For the next 30 years, the Shield was largely forgotten except for occasional examination by military engineers who heard about it and wanted to see this impossible object for themselves. A few photographs were taken in the 1870s for archival purposes. A sketch artist made detailed drawings in 1881. A young Lieutenant John Pershing examined it in 1886 and wrote a letter to his commander mentioning it, but nothing came of that. The Shield remained an unsolved puzzle, a physical object that demonstrated capabilities that military science couldn't explain. And in that wooden crate in that warehouse, it preserved knowledge about materials and construction that had been refined over centuries by people whose engineering sophistication was never recognized by the nation that had captured one small example of their work. What those military analysts were encountering was technology that predated European presence in North America by centuries. The Arapaho people, along with their Cheyenne, Lakota, Sioux, Crow, Blackfoot, and other Plains allies, had refined the art of shield making to a level of sophistication that matched or exceeded any leather armor produced in Europe during the Middle Ages. But where European armor makers wrote down their techniques in guild records and military manuals that survived in libraries and archives, where craftsmen could reference written specifications and pass knowledge through documents as well as demonstration, Plains tribes preserved this knowledge through oral tradition and hands-on teaching that left no paper trail for military engineers to analyze, and no written specifications for competitors to copy or understand. The transmission method shaped the knowledge itself. European armor making could be standardized because written specifications created uniformity. An armor maker in London and one in Milan could produce similar results because they were following similar written procedures, refined over generations and recorded in guild documents. Plains shield making varied more because knowledge was transmitted personally from master to apprentice, with each master incorporating their own refinements and preferences. But it also incorporated levels of tacit knowledge that written instructions couldn't convey. You had to feel when the hide was ready for the next treatment stage. You had to smell when decomposition was progressing properly versus beginning to rot. You had to see the subtle texture changes that indicated successful transformation. These experiential benchmarks couldn't be written down in ways that conveyed the necessary information to someone who hadn't already learned through supervised practice. The shield that stopped Private Hawthorne's bullet wasn't magic. It wasn't the result of spiritual power alone, though spiritual practices played important roles in the shield's creation and use that we'll explore later. It was materials science applied with precision that came from centuries of observation, experimentation, and the kind of rigorous testing that only happens when your life depends on the results and when failure means you don't live to learn from your mistakes. Now, to understand what made that shield capable of stopping a .58 caliber rifle ball and why military analysts in Washington couldn't explain it, we need to understand what the Arapaho knew about transforming buffalo hide into something stronger than wood. We need to understand not just what they did, but why it worked, how they discovered it, and what knowledge had to accumulate over generations to make that single moment of protection possible. We need to enter the world of the plains warriors and shield makers who perfected this craft through centuries of warfare, testing, and refinement. The Great Plains in the mid-1800s was a landscape of violence that would be difficult for modern Americans to fully comprehend. Not the romantic violence of dime novels where heroes died cleanly with stirring last words and villains were clearly identified, but the grinding practical violence of survival in an environment that offered no second chances and no appeals to higher authority. Warfare between tribes over hunting territories and resources was constant and brutal. The buffalo herds that sustained plains life were finite and mobile. When drought hit one region, tribes dependent on that region's herds had to move or starve. Moving meant entering territory claimed by other tribes. That meant fighting. The winners ate. The losers scattered to seek shelter with allies or died trying to survive on depleted resources. These weren't abstract conflicts over ideology or political principles. They were existential struggles over who got to eat. A warrior who died in battle left a family that would struggle to survive without his hunting skills and protection. A band that lost too many warriors would be absorbed by stronger allies or would simply cease to exist as its members scattered to join other groups. Conflicts with encroaching settlers added another layer of violence. Europeans wanted the land and didn't much care what happened to the people already living on it. Treaties were signed and broken with casual disregard for the promises made. Settlement pressure pushed tribes into closer proximity, increasing intertribal conflicts as groups competed for shrinking resources. The buffalo herds began declining under commercial hunting pressure from white hunters who killed for hides and left the meat to rot. And underlying everything was the brutal reality of hunting animals large enough to kill you if the first strike failed. Buffalo weren't passive resources waiting to be harvested. They were dangerous animals that killed hunters regularly. A wounded buffalo could charge with shocking speed and devastating force. Hunters who got too close or whose first shot didn't drop the animal immediately sometimes paid with their lives, gored by horns or trampled under hooves that could shatter bones. In this environment, protection wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't about looking impressive during parades or ceremonies, though shields certainly served those functions too during times of peace. Protection was the difference between watching your children grow up and being buried on the prairie with your family scattered to allied bands who would take them in but couldn't replace what they'd lost. Protection was the margin between a successful hunt that fed the band through winter and a wounded hunter who became a burden his family could barely afford, consuming resources without being able to contribute to obtaining them. The Arapaho understood this with the clarity that comes from losing warriors who weren't properly equipped. Every band had oral histories that preserved specific examples of how protection, or its absence, had determined outcomes in crucial moments. Oral histories from the 19th century, recorded by anthropologists working with tribal elders in the early 1900s before that generation passed away, preserve stories about specific battles where the difference between victory and defeat came down to which warriors had shields and which didn't. These weren't vague legends about mythical ancestors. They were remembered accounts of specific events from living memory, told by elders who had participated in those events or who had heard the accounts directly from participants. One account, recorded in 1903 by ethnographer George Dorsey, working with Arapaho elders who had been relocated to Oklahoma, describes a battle from the 1840s between Arapaho and Pawnee forces near the Platte River. The account was told by an elder named Hawken, who had been present at the battle as a young warrior. His memory, 40 years later, remained clear about the crucial details. The Arapaho warriors, equipped with shields made by a master craftsman named Left Hand, who was renowned throughout the tribe for his skill, suffered only 2 casualties in a fight that should have been much bloodier based on the number of warriors engaged and the intensity of the fighting. The Pawnee, despite superior numbers, perhaps 40 warriors against 30 Arapaho, and good defensive positioning behind fallen logs, couldn't overcome the protection the shields provided. Arrows that should have killed struck shields and broke or bounced off. Hawken remembered watching arrows hit shields and shatter, the stone points breaking against the hardened hide, the shafts spinning away uselessly. He remembered the psychological effect this had on both sides. The Arapaho warriors grew bolder, advancing under arrow fire that normally would have forced them to take cover. The Pawnee warriors grew desperate, shooting arrows that accomplished nothing, watching their most powerful shots defeated by equipment they hadn't expected to be so effective. The account mentions specific warriors by name, personalizing events that might otherwise seem like generic battle descriptions. Bear Chief, a young warrior fighting in his 3rd major battle, took 7 arrow strikes to his shield without injury. Each impact left a mark on the shield's surface, but none penetrated deeply enough to threaten him. He returned home with his shield looking like a target at practice range, but without a scratch on his body. White Thunder, an experienced warrior known for aggressive tactics, had his shield turn aside 3 arrows in the space of perhaps 10 heartbeats during a close-quarters fight when a Pawnee warrior managed to get within 15 feet and shot repeatedly at close range where arrow velocity was maximum. The first arrow embedded in the shield deeply enough that White Thunder felt the impact through his arm, but it didn't penetrate. The second arrow hit at an angle and glanced off, deflected by the point shield's curved surface and hardened hide. The third arrow struck near where the first had hit, but the shield maintained its integrity. White Thunder closed the distance and killed his attacker with a war club before the man could draw his knife. Young Wolf, fighting in his first major battle and probably terrified, though the account doesn't emphasize that detail, used his shield to deflect the lance thrust that would have killed him. The Pawnee warrior who attacked him was experienced and powerful, driving the lance with force that should have punched through. But young Wolf managed to angle his shield correctly, something he'd practiced hundreds of times in training but had never tested in actual combat, and the lance point glanced off the hardened hide. The force of the deflection threw young Wolf off balance, but he was alive. He recovered, closed with his attacker, and killed him with a war club strike to the head that crushed the skull. These weren't legends about supernatural heroes who couldn't be killed. They were remembered accounts of specific individuals whose shields had saved their lives through effective engineering rather than magic. The shields worked because they'd been made correctly by someone who knew what he was doing, and the warriors survived because they'd trained to use their shields effectively and had equipment they could trust. There are also accounts of young warriors who went into that same battle without proper shields because they hadn't yet earned the right to commission one or hadn't completed their apprenticeship to learn shield making themselves. The oral histories mention them too, but briefly, as cautionary examples of what happened when warriors faced combat without proper protection. Running Elk, killed by a Pawnee arrow in his first battle at age 17. The arrow caught him in the chest when he rose from cover to shoot. He died within minutes, drowning in his own blood as the arrow had punctured his lung. His family mourned him, but everyone understood that his death had been avoidable. If he'd had a shield, he likely would have survived. Swift Fox, killed by a Crow lance thrust during a different engagement at age 18. The lance caught him in the abdomen, disemboweling him. He died slowly over several hours in tremendous pain. His death was remembered as particularly tragic because he'd been a promising young warrior skilled with bow and lance, but he'd gone into combat without adequate protection because he was impatient and hadn't wanted to wait the additional year it would have taken to properly prepare a shield. Stands Alone, killed by Ute arrows at age 16 during a skirmish over hunting territory. Multiple arrows hit him when he was caught in the open between cover points. Any one of them might have been survivable, but the combination killed him quickly. His death was especially hard on his mother, who had already lost 2 other children to disease. She never fully recovered from the loss. Every shield represented not just craft skill, but accumulated knowledge about what worked when arrows flew and rifle balls screamed across open ground. The tribes that survived the constant warfare of the 18th and 19th centuries were the tribes that learned faster, remembered better, and taught more effectively than their neighbors. Knowledge was survival advantage measured not in abstract points, but in bodies that came home versus bodies that stayed on the battlefield. This created intense pressure to preserve and transmit effective techniques. A band that lost shield-making knowledge because a master craftsman died before training successors would see its warriors dying at higher rates in subsequent conflicts. Other bands, seeing this, would be more careful about ensuring knowledge transmission. The result was cultural practices that prioritized teaching and that created redundancy in knowledge preservation, multiple apprentices learning from each master, knowledge shared among craftsmen rather than jealously guarded, techniques demonstrated publicly during ceremonies where younger men could observe even if they weren't formal apprentices. Buffalo provided the raw material for shields, but not just any buffalo and not just any part of the animal. The selection process that began Arapaho shield making would have seemed excessive to European armor makers used to working with whatever leather the tanners provided. European armor production was industrialized by the standards of its time. Tanneries produced standardized leather suitable for various purposes. An armor maker in London or Milan would purchase leather from tanners specifying desired thickness and quality, but essentially acting as a customer purchasing finished material from a separate industry. The tanner controlled the material production. The armor maker controlled the final product manufacturing. Each specialized in their portion of the process. This separation created efficiency in some ways. Each specialist could focus on what they did best, but it also created inflexibility. The armor maker had to work with whatever the tanner could provide. If the available leather wasn't quite optimal for a specific purpose, the armor maker had to make do. The Arapaho couldn't afford that separation between material production and final product manufacturing. Resources were too limited and consequences of failure too severe to accept anything less than optimal materials. The shield maker controlled the entire process from animal selection through final construction, because every stage affected final quality and every decision mattered. The wrong hide meant a shield that might fail at the worst possible moment, and failure meant death. Not abstract professional failure, but literal death on the battlefield. Mature bulls provided the best shields, specifically bulls in their prime between 5 and 8 years old. This wasn't arbitrary. Age selection based on tradition handed down without understanding or superstition about animal spirits. It was empirical knowledge gained through centuries of observation and testing, verified through the ultimate test of combat effectiveness. The age specification was based on understanding buffalo development and how that development affected hide properties. Younger animals, below 5 years old, hadn't developed the dense shoulder and neck hide that shield makers needed. The hide was too thin, typically less than a 1/4 inch, even at the shoulder where bulls developed their thickest hide. It was too elastic, stretching too much under impact rather than remaining rigid enough to stop penetration. It lacked the structural strength that came from years of development and mechanical stressing through combat. A shield made from young bull hide might work against light arrows shot from long range, where velocity had dropped and impact force was reduced, but it would fail against war arrows shot from close range by powerful archers. It would certainly fail against rifle fire. The warrior carrying such a shield might think he was protected, but that protection would prove illusory when it was tested under the worst possible circumstances. The development of shoulder hide thickness in buffalo bulls followed predictable patterns tied to sexual maturity and fighting experience. Modern biologists who studied buffalo before the herds were nearly exterminated confirmed what Arapaho shield makers had known empirically. Hide thickness and density correlated directly with age and fighting experience in ways that were reliable and observable. Bulls began developing their characteristic shoulder humps around age 3, as testosterone drove muscle development in preparation for the dominance fights that would determine breeding access. Male buffalo don't breed through cooperation. They breed through dominance hierarchies, established and maintained through violent combat. Young bulls had to develop the muscle mass and protective adaptations that would allow them to survive these fights. The hide over these developing muscles thickened in response to the mechanical stresses the bulls were beginning to experience. Early fights were usually brief and not particularly violent. Young bulls testing each other, establishing initial rankings without committing to full-force combat. But even these early fights put stress on the shoulder hide, and that stress stimulated development. By age 5, a bull in good condition would have shoulder hide approaching the optimal thickness for shield making, typically 3/8 to half an inch, depending on the individual animal and its nutrition level. The hide had developed dense collagen structure to protect the muscles beneath from the impacts of fighting. More importantly, the hide had been stressed repeatedly through several seasons of dominance fights, and this mechanical stress had caused the collagen fibers to align and compress in ways that increased strength beyond what simple thickness would provide. Between 5 and 8 years old, bulls were at peak condition. The shoulder hide was fully developed, properly stressed through years of fighting, thick enough to work with, but not yet showing the deterioration that came with advanced age. The hide would be between 3/8 and 5/8 of an inch thick at the shoulder, thick enough to provide substantial protection once properly treated, but not so thick that it became unworkably rigid or excessively heavy. The bulls in this age range were also at peak fighting frequency. They were old enough to compete seriously for breeding access, but young enough to still be competing rather than dominating. They fought more often than younger or older bulls, and these fights were intense and sustained. Every fight stressed the shoulder hide, and every cycle of stress and recovery made the hide stronger and more suitable for shield making. Older bulls, beyond 8 years, developed hide that was too thick and inflexible to work properly. The collagen structure became rigid and brittle with age, prone to cracking under impact rather than absorbing force through slight flexion. The hide thickness could exceed 3/4 of an inch at the shoulder, which sounds advantageous until you tried to work with it and discovered the problems excessive thickness created. The material was so stiff that it couldn't be properly compressed during treatment. The hardening processes that worked on younger hide would make old bull hide so brittle it would shatter when struck rather than stopping projectiles. The weight became excessive. A shield made from old bull hide might weigh 12 or 15 pounds instead of the 7 to 8 pounds of an optimal shield, and that extra weight would exhaust a warrior during extended combat. Shield makers could identify optimal age bulls through several physical signs that modern biologists have confirmed correlate with age. Horn wear and shape indicated years of fighting. Horns got shorter and more blunted with age as impacts wore them down. Facial scarring showed combat experience. Bulls with more scars had been in more fights. Shoulder hump size and density revealed muscle development. Larger, denser humps indicated mature bulls in fighting prime. Coat condition reflected overall health. Thick, lustrous coats indicated good nutrition and optimal physical condition. An experienced shield maker could watch a buffalo herd and identify the handful of bulls that would provide optimal hide within minutes of observation. He didn't need to examine the animals closely or kill them first to check. The relevant indicators were visible from distance, and a master craftsman had trained his eyes to recognize them automatically. The window was narrow, and selecting the right animal required knowledge passed from master craftsmen to apprentices over years of training. An apprentice might spend several years learning just to evaluate buffalo for shield potential before ever attempting to process a hide. The evaluation required understanding buffalo behavior, recognizing age indicators that varied individually and seasonally, assessing health from posture and movement patterns, and estimating hide properties from external characteristics that required experience to read accurately. Get the selection wrong, And you'd waste weeks of work processing hide that would produce an inferior shield. In a culture where time and resources were precious, where winter was always coming and preparation was always urgent, wasting weeks on suboptimal hide was a serious error that reflected poorly on the craftsman's skill and judgment. The selection process started during the hunt itself, with shield makers or their apprentices accompanying hunting parties specifically to evaluate potential shield material. They weren't there to hunt. That was the hunter's job, and specialization meant letting each person focus on what they did best. The shield makers were there to watch the buffalo, identifying bulls of the right age and condition before the hunt began, so hunters would know which animals to target if the opportunity arose. They looked for animals with specific characteristics that indicated optimal hide quality, characteristics that had been identified through generations of observation and correlated with successful shield production. Thick shoulder humps were the first indicator anyone looked for. A fully developed hump showed muscle mass that required substantial hide protection. The hump's shape mattered too. Bulls that had fought more developed asymmetric humps from favoring one side during charges, and this asymmetry indicated extensive combat experience that had stressed the hide in ways that enhanced its properties. The stress made the hide tougher, denser, more suitable for protection. Healthy coats showed good nutrition. A bull with a thick, lustrous coat had been eating well, and good nutrition meant optimal hide development. Poor nutrition caused the hide to thin as the animal used body resources for survival, essentially cannibalizing its own hide to keep vital organs functioning. Even if the bull was the right age, inadequate nutrition would have compromised hide quality in ways that treatment couldn't fully reverse. Scars from fighting were actually desirable rather than concerning. They showed the animal had survived conflicts that tested the hide's natural toughness. Scar tissue in hide, properly processed, could actually increase strength in those areas through the fiber realignment that occurred during healing. The presence of well-healed scars indicated a bull that had been in multiple fights and had hide tough enough to survive them without catastrophic damage. Movement patterns indicated strength and health in ways that mattered for hide quality. Bulls that moved powerfully, that ran without hesitation when the herd moved, that held dominant positions in herd social structure were likely to have the overall condition that correlated with optimal hide properties. Sick or injured bulls, even if they were the right age, would have compromised hide quality because illness or injury affected the entire body, including hide development. Sometimes a hunting party would pass up easier kills because the shield maker shook his head, indicating the animal wasn't right for shield material. This required discipline from hunters who might be hungry or who wanted the prestige of a kill. But the discipline was maintained because everyone understood the value of a properly made shield. The social dynamics around this practice revealed the priority given to shield making. Hunters had status. They fed the band. Killing buffalo required skill and courage, and successful hunters were respected. But when a shield maker indicated that a particular bull shouldn't be killed, hunters deferred to that judgment even if it meant passing up an easier kill or extending the hunt. A family might go hungry for another day if passing up a suboptimal bull meant waiting for better opportunity. But a warrior with a good shield might keep his family fed and protected for years or even decades if the shield was made well enough. The trade-off was worth it from the band's perspective. Short-term hunger was temporary. Long-term military capability determined the band's survival in the competitive environment of plains warfare. The social structure of Arapaho bands reinforced this priority through formal and informal mechanisms. A warrior who owned a good shield increased the entire band's military effectiveness and improved everyone's survival odds. When that warrior went into battle, his shield protected not just him, but potentially the warriors fighting beside him who could take cover behind his protection. His survival meant his family didn't become dependents requiring support from others. His effectiveness in battle meant the band could defend its territory and hunting grounds against competitors. The short-term sacrifice of passing up an easier kill was justified by the long-term benefit of obtaining proper shield material. Everyone in the band understood this calculation, and social pressure maintained the discipline needed to make optimal choices rather than convenient ones. The timing of the hunt mattered almost as much as the animal itself. Late summer and early fall, after the bulls had grazed on rich prairie grass through the growing season, produced hide at peak condition. This timing wasn't arbitrary or based on ceremonial calendar. It correlated with the buffalo's natural life cycle in ways that affected hide properties measurably. During summer, prairie grasses reached peak nutritional content. The grasses had been growing through spring and early summer, storing nutrients and building biomass. Buffalo could eat abundantly, building up fat reserves that insulated and protected the hide. A bull feeding on peak-condition prairie grass would gain weight rapidly, sometimes adding hundreds of pounds of fat and muscle between early summer and late fall. The fat layer beneath the hide reached maximum thickness, sometimes exceeding 4 inches on well-fed bulls in good habitat. This fat layer served multiple functions beyond just energy storage for winter. It provided insulation against temperature extremes, both the heat of summer and the cold of winter. It cushioned the hide from impacts during fights, reducing mechanical damage that would have weakened the hide structure. It maintained hide hydration by preventing excessive moisture loss through the skin. The hide itself thickened during this period of abundant nutrition. Well-fed bulls developed hide that was typically 10 to 15% thicker than the same bulls would have in spring after winter had depleted their resources. This wasn't just water weight or temporary swelling. The body was actually building more hide tissue, increasing collagen production, thickening the structural layers in response to good nutrition. The collagen structure became denser, with tighter fiber packing and better hydration. The molecular bonds between collagen fibers strengthened. The hide was at its optimal mechanical properties, strong, flexible enough to work with during processing, resilient under stress, capable of surviving the intensive treatment process without breaking down. The bulls were also in peak fighting condition during late summer and early fall as the rut approached. The breeding season occurred in July through September, and in the weeks leading up to it, bulls competed intensely for dominance positions that would determine breeding access. The approaching breeding season meant increased testosterone levels, which drove muscle development and aggressive behavior. Bulls fought more frequently during this period, sometimes engaging in multiple dominance fights per day. These fights put mechanical stress on the shoulder hide that further enhanced its properties through a process that modern materials scientists would recognize as work hardening. The repeated stress and recovery cycles aligned collagen fibers, increased fiber density, and created structural improvements that made the hide even more suitable for shield making. The hide was being conditioned through natural use in ways that prepared it for its eventual use as a shield. Nature was essentially doing part of the shield maker's work through the mechanical stressing that bulls experienced in their normal lives. Spring hide, by contrast, was too thin and had compromised properties that made it unsuitable for shields. Bulls coming out of winter had depleted their fat reserves, surviving months of limited food availability and harsh weather. The fat layer that had been 4 inches thick in fall might be reduced to less than an inch by late winter. The body had consumed its stored energy to maintain vital functions through the period of scarce resources. The hide, which thickened and thinned with the animal's overall condition, was at its minimum thickness and strength by late winter and early spring. A bull that had shoulder hide 5/8 of an inch thick in late summer might have shoulder hide barely 3/8 of an inch thick by late winter. That difference was enough to determine whether a shield would be adequate or inadequate in combat. The collagen structure was also compromised by winter conditions in ways that even abundant spring nutrition couldn't quickly reverse. Dehydration from cold, dry winter air affected the hide's molecular structure. Collagen requires proper hydration to maintain optimal properties, and winter dehydration disrupted the molecular organization. Reduced nutrition meant the body couldn't maintain optimal collagen production, so natural replacement of damaged fibers occurred more slowly than damage accumulated. The mechanical stress of surviving winter, the cold, the movement through snow, the reduced cushioning from depleted fat reserves all contributed to hide degradation. The hide experienced stress without the recovery periods and nutritional support needed to rebuild and strengthen. The cumulative damage couldn't be fully reversed by a few weeks of spring nutrition. Deep winter hide was too weather damaged to produce optimal shields, even if the bull was the right age and had been in good condition the previous fall. The freezing temperatures caused ice crystal formation in the hide tissue that disrupted collagen fiber structure at the molecular level. Ice crystals are sharp, and as they formed within tissue, they essentially cut through cellular structures and damaged fiber alignment. The constant exposure to wind and cold caused surface damage that penetrated deep into the hide. The hide's surface would dry and crack in response to sub-freezing temperatures and low humidity. These surface cracks might seem minor, but they propagated into the hide's deeper layers, creating structural weaknesses that would persist even after the hide was processed. The reduced nutrition as prairie grasses died back meant the hide wasn't receiving the nutrients needed to maintain optimal condition or to repair damage. The body prioritized vital organs over hide during times of nutritional stress, so hide essentially became a resource that the body drew on rather than maintained. Shield makers knew these patterns through generations of observation and through shields that had failed because someone hadn't been patient enough to wait for the right season. The oral traditions preserved specific examples that every apprentice learned as cautionary tales. A shield made from spring hide that had cracked when struck by a war club during a fight with Crow warriors in the 1820s, killing the warrior who had trusted it. The warrior's name was remembered, too. Hawks, and the circumstances of his death were preserved in detail. He had been an experienced fighter, skilled and brave, but his shield had been made from hide obtained at the wrong season. When a Crow warrior struck the shield with a heavy war club during close combat, the shield cracked rather than absorbing the blow, and the club continued through to strike 2 hawks in the shoulder, breaking his collarbone and making him drop his weapons. He died minutes later when another Crow warrior killed him while he was disabled. A shield made from winter hide that had allowed arrow penetration that should have been stopped, ending a young warrior's life in his first major battle during a fight with Pawnee in the 1830s. The warrior was called Runs Fast, aged 19, fighting alongside his father and older brother. An arrow shot from moderate range struck his shield and penetrated completely when it should have been stopped. The arrow point entered his chest just below the collarbone, puncturing his lung. He tried to continue fighting, but collapsed within minutes, coughing blood. He died before the battle ended, probably drowning in his own blood as his punctured lung filled. These weren't abstract lessons or hypothetical examples used to make a pedagogical point. They were remembered tragedies that reinforced the importance of proper timing in shield making. Every master shield maker knew stories about shortcuts that had killed people, and these stories were part of teaching apprentices why the traditional timing mattered and why being impatient or cutting corners could have fatal consequences. The stories personalized the lessons in ways that made them memorable and emotionally resonant. It wasn't just spring hide doesn't work as well. It was 2 hawks died because his shield was made from spring hide, and his wife had to raise their 3 children alone. That level of specificity and connection to real consequences made the lessons stick in ways that abstract technical instruction couldn't match. The calendar dictated when shields could be made, and warriors planned their protection needs accordingly with the same seriousness that farmers planned planting seasons. A young man hoping to have a shield by his 19th summer needed to begin preparations at least a year in advance, sometimes longer if circumstances weren't favorable. He needed to prove himself worthy of a shield through actions that demonstrated he was serious about becoming a warrior rather than just wanting to look impressive. This might involve success in hunting, demonstrating the skills and courage needed to kill dangerous animals. It might involve showing skill in combat training against other young warriors, proving he could handle weapons effectively and move correctly in simulated combat. It might involve demonstrating dedication through service to the band, showing he understood that being a warrior meant serving the community rather than just seek personal glory. It might involve completing spiritual preparations that showed mental readiness for the responsibility of carrying protective equipment that might mean the difference between life and death for himself and others who fought beside him. The proving period served multiple purposes beyond just testing the young man's commitment. It gave him time to develop the physical skills needed to use a shield effectively in combat. Shields weren't particularly heavy, but they required specific techniques to position correctly, to move quickly between different positions, to use offensively as well as defensively. These techniques required practice to master, and the young man would spend months or years training while he waited for the opportunity to obtain proper shield materials. It also gave him time to understand the responsibility he was taking on. A warrior with a shield was declaring that he was ready to stand in the front line of combat to protect others as well as himself, to take on a role that brought status but also brought expectations of courage and skill. The community needed to know that he understood this responsibility and was ready to fulfill it before they would support his efforts to obtain a shield. He needed to ensure that when the right buffalo were available during late summer hunt, he had the status and resources to claim the hide. this wasn't simply a matter of killing a buffalo himself, though doing so would certainly help his case and demonstrate his hunting abilities. The hide claim often involved complex social negotiations that reflected the band's social structure and the value placed on shield materials. Senior warriors had priority for prime hides based on their status and service to the band. They'd earned the right to first choice through years of successful warfare and hunting. A young man couldn't simply push ahead of these established warriors without violating social norms that maintained band cohesion. Young men might need to trade for hide access, offering horses, goods, or services to secure the right to use hide from a buffalo killed by someone else. Horses were valuable, and trading one or more horses for shield material was a significant investment that demonstrated serious commitment. Goods might include weapons, tools, or items obtained through trade with other tribes. Services might involve helping with hunts, assisting in warfare, or committing to support the hide's original claimant in future conflicts. These negotiations were part of the band's economic and social system. They ensured that resources were distributed based on merit and need rather than just random chance. They created relationships of mutual obligation that strengthened band cohesion. And they meant that young warriors learned diplomacy and negotiation skills as part of earning their shields. And he needed to allow time for the lengthy construction process that would stretch through fall and into winter. Shield making couldn't be rushed without compromising quality. Each stage of the process required specific time periods. The initial hide processing took days to weeks depending on environmental conditions. The smoking and hardening processes required multiple stages separated by rest periods. The assembly and finishing work required careful attention to detail that couldn't be hurried. A shield begun in late August, when optimal hide became available, might not be finished until December or even later if the treatment process encountered problems or if weather interfered with the smoking stages that required specific temperature and humidity conditions. The construction couldn't be rushed without producing inferior results that would defeat the entire purpose of taking the time to do it right. Warriors had to plan months ahead if they wanted shields ready for the next fighting season. Fighting on the plains was somewhat seasonal. More conflicts occurred in spring and summer when travel was easier and when buffalo hunts brought different tribes into proximity. Winter warfare was less common because conditions made movement difficult and because everyone was focused on surviving the cold rather than fighting. But threats could emerge at any time, and a warrior without a shield when one was needed might not survive to regret his poor planning. The specific part of the buffalo used for shield making was crucial and represented sophisticated understanding of animal anatomy and hide properties that came from close observation and testing over many generations. The heavy shoulder hide, where the massive hump muscles attached to the skeleton, provided the densest and most suitable material. This wasn't arbitrary selection based on hide thickness alone or tradition that had lost its rational basis. The shoulder hide had specific properties that came from the incredible forces it had to withstand during the buffalo's life. Bulls used their shoulders as weapons and shields during the violent head-to-head combat that determined herd hierarchy every rut season. These fights were genuinely violent encounters that modern observers who've never seen them have difficulty comprehending the force involved. The impacts were tremendous. The forces involved were sufficient to cause serious injury or death if the bulls weren't evolved to withstand them. two bulls, each weighing upward of 2,000 pounds, would charge each other at full speed across open ground. The charge acceleration could reach 30 miles per hour or more before impact. At that speed, 2,000 pounds of buffalo carried kinetic energy comparable to a small automobile at highway speed. Thousands of foot-pounds of kinetic energy concentrated in the skull and shoulder structure. The collision, when it came, would literally shape the ground hard enough to be felt by observers. People standing 100 yards away could feel the vibration through their feet when two large bulls collided at full speed. The sound was like a tree falling or a large rock being struck with a sledgehammer, a deep, resonant crack that carried across the prairie for a quarter mile or more. Birds would startle from nearby grass. Other buffalo in the herd would move away from the combatants, creating a cleared space around the fight. The force transmitted through the bulls' skulls during impact would have shattered human bones instantly. Human skulls and neck structures weren't designed for this kind of force. A human experiencing the forces of a buffalo collision would suffer immediate catastrophic injury, shattered skull, severed spinal cord, massive brain trauma. Death would be essentially instantaneous. Humans have skull structures designed for flexibility and lightness because humans don't fight by ramming heads together. Human skulls protect the brain from normal impacts and provide attachment points for jaw muscles, but they're not built to absorb the forces of high-speed collisions. Human neck vertebrae are relatively delicate, designed for mobility and fine control rather than absorbing tremendous compressive forces. Buffalo have skull structures designed specifically to absorb these devastating impacts through millions of years of evolution that were selected for bulls who could survive violent combat. The skull bones are tremendously thick, several inches of solid bone in some areas. The bone has internal structures that dissipate force, with crumple zones and stress distribution patterns that modern engineers would recognize as sophisticated impact engineering. The brain is cushioned by cerebrospinal fluid and protective membranes that absorb shock. The entire system is engineered by evolution to survive collisions that would kill most other animals.
If this story of frontier technology and indigenous innovation captured your attention, leave a like to help others discover these histories. Thanks for exploring the Western Pioneer archives with us.